And what we are seeing is the development of stronger alliances to challenge that. I think the G7 has been very significant in leading on sanctions on Russia and delivering wave after wave of sanctions that have debilitated the Russian economy. Most recently this weekend we agreed to new sanctions on gold, but we have had 7 coordinated waves of sanctions from the G7. And what I want to see the G7 acting is as an economic NATO. So not just looking at the challenge of Russia, but also the challenge of China. And in our recent G7 foreign ministers meeting, we put out a statement about Chinese economic coercion. So that is a key part, as far as I'm concerned, of the network of liberty. And of course, the GDP of the G7 is 50% of the global economy. So when we act collectively, we can ensure different outcomes and we can incentivize other nations differently. NATO is also extremely important. We want to see an expanded NATO, we want to see a stronger NATO, we want to see more activity on the eastern flank. After this FAC hearing, I'm going to Madrid for Nato Summit, which will be very important because it sets the new strategic context. Yeah.
That's right. So President Macron said that you'd agreed to join the political economic community. What does that mean?
That's not true. That we've agreed. Well, I don't know the exact words that President Macron has used, but we have not agreed to that. We see the key guarantor of security in Europe as being NATO. And our aims and ambitions are to strengthen NATO, and we see the G7 as the absolutely key economic alliance for us. And we've been working very closely with G7 partners throughout the Russian-Ukraine crisis. In fact, just 2 days ago, I had a video conference with my G7 counterparts to coordinate next steps. So those are what we see as the key alliances as far as the United Kingdom is concerned.
Okay, so you don't buy into his political economic community?
No.
Okay, that's not what he said, but it would be useful to know then...
I mean, I haven't discussed it with him direct, and Chairman, I'm visiting France on Friday, where I'll meet Catherine Colonna, my French counterpart, so no doubt if there are proposals afoot, we will discuss them. But we've been developing our bilateral relationships with many EU countries. We've now signed 13 bilateral agreements since EU exit, and we have 7 more due to be signed in the coming months. Most recently, a bilateral agreement with Portugal. So we're developing bilateral relationships. I speak regularly to the EU. We also have the Joint Expeditionary Force collaborating on the security side as well. So we have plentiful and positive relationships with our European friends.
Let's talk about NATO just briefly, and we'll come back to some aspects of this. But one of the aspects of NATO that's been really important recently is the application for membership by Sweden and Finland, something that's supported by, I think, the whole House. I'd be interested to know how you're working with Turkey in resolving some of the obstacles that seem to be blocking Sweden's in particular, but Sweden and Finland's membership.
Well, I visited Ankara last week and I had talks with my foreign minister counterpart. There are a few remaining issues to be agreed. We are strongly supportive of Sweden and Finland joining NATO. We believe it would strengthen the northern flank in particular, but also add huge value to the alliance. I am hopeful that an agreement can be reached. There have been discussions taking place between NATO, Turkey, Finland and Sweden, and the United Kingdom has been supporting those discussions.
Did you see them joining in Madrid?
I very much hope that we will see significant progress at Madrid. I can't commit to that. You know, the UK is not a party to the direct discussions between Turkey, Finland and Sweden, but we all want to resolve the issues so those 2 countries are able to join.
Okay. If we can move on to your own department, it's been now a year since the department was merged with the 2 departments were merged, DFID and the Foreign Office. How is the efficiency working? How is that? How are you counting whether or not this has been a productive merger? What have you done differently and what have you done better?
Well, I'm going to ask Philip to talk about some of the more organisational the merger. But what I've done since becoming Foreign Secretary and since the Russian invasion of Ukraine is restructure the department, first of all, to have clearer geographical accountability. Secondly, to make sure we're focused more on geopolitics. So we now have a geopolitics Director General responsible for geopolitics and security. We've also beefed up Kumar's area, particularly with work on economic security, and we've created a dedicated development Director General. And I think that was very important because when I arrived at the department, development was interspersed through the department. And of course, there is a development angle to virtually every part of the world we deal with. But there wasn't leadership at the board level for development. So we've now fixed that.
You're recreating the ODA effectively within the FCO.
We're creating a dedicated leader for development. That is Nick Dyer. So he is responsible for delivering the international development strategy that we launched about a month ago. So we've created that structure within the department. We've created more geographical accountability, for example, around the Indo-Pacific, around Europe, around Africa and Latin America, and around America and the Middle East. Because what I found before is there was more of a matrix structure and the accountability wasn't clear enough. So those are the changes I've made as Foreign Secretary, but I will hand over to Philip just to say a bit more about the...
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Chair, when the Prime Minister announced the merger, he wanted us to be more coherent and have more impact in our international work. And I think the things that I would point to over the first year and a half of the new department are, firstly, delivery of the year of UK international leadership last year, very successful G7, COP26, and the Global Partnership for Education Summit in the middle of the year. Again, in all of those, we, FCDO, were the heart of the UK's work on that, and we did achieve more by doing diplomacy and development together. And then if you look at, for example, at our response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have been more agile by having the development side absolutely in from the first steps, as it were, as we've looked at, for example, how we've done humanitarian support in the region, how we thought about the secondary consequences of the invasion around food insecurity around the world. And just a third example, Chair, when we've tried to relieve humanitarian suffering, I think we've done a better job at putting our political and diplomatic influence alongside that. So, for example, as we've worked with traditional development partners like the World Food Programme to get supplies into Tigray in light of the conflict there, we've also been able to use our diplomatic influence alongside that to secure access. So I think we are achieving what the Prime Minister wanted: more coherence, more impact.
Do you see development spending principally as a tool of diplomacy?
It has various purposes, but it has to be a coherent part of our foreign policy. And one of the concerns I've had about development spending in the past is it contributing to our overall objectives of promoting freedom and democracy around the world? And are we looking at it in a way that challenges some of the geopolitical efforts by malign actors? This is why we launched British international investment as an alternative to strings attached investment from countries like China. And in fact, we're now working much more collaboratively with our G7 partners. So this weekend, we launched the Global Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment, which is $600 billion of spending. And it's a G7 collective effort to challenge the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So I think we need to be, of course, focused on alleviating humanitarian suffering, but we also need to look at the future geopolitics. And is our development spending pushing in the right direction, or are we inadvertently contributing to countries being pulled towards authoritarian regimes? So we look at it through that lens, as well as looking at it through the humanitarian lens.
So you're talking about, I mean, quite understandably, you're talking about trade as an instrument of foreign policy there. Do you think you should be merged with the Department for International Trade as well?
No, I don't. We work very closely in collaboration with the Department of Trade. and indeed with the Ministry of Defence. But I think it's right that we have separate cabinet ministers for those roles, because there is a significant amount of work and different focuses required. But what we now have across development, trade, security, defence, diplomacy is a coherent foreign policy, all pointing in the same direction.
Now, your annual report and accounts state that the merger has put a lot of pressure on staff. I'm sure everybody will be very understanding of that. What has the impact been, and how have you sought to resolve that situation?
I think staff have been affected, of course, by the merger, but also by COVID. I mean, it's had a very difficult effect on the Foreign Office in particular. People weren't able to come home from some countries. It's very hard to communicate. It's very hard to do the job of a diplomat when you can't meet people. And we are now emerging from that. I think, and Philip can sort of give them more details on this, I don't think we've seen an increase in turnover of staff from either organisation. We are doing more work to bring talent into the organisation, particularly to make sure that we've got the right expertise in areas like technology, in areas like economics under Kumar. There is more work needed to reflect what we have to do in modern diplomacy, and the fact that economic coercion is becoming a much bigger issue. But maybe you want to...
So, I think, Chair, as the Foreign Secretary said, COVID clearly had a very significant impact. It has on everybody, but for us, our ability to do our work, our ability for our diplomats overseas to remain connected with their lives in the UK was harder. We're emerging from that. I think what we're seeing now is people in the department taking pride in what we're achieving, taking pride in the things I described earlier, where we are achieving more by being more coherent and doing things together. And what we've seen around the kind of, if you like, the cross-fertilisation of former DFID, really deep expertise in how you do significant programs and affect change that way, with former FCO agility, and the coming together and bringing the best of us into one sense of purpose. You've got a clear sense of mission now, delivering for the UK across diplomacy, development and our consular work. As I say, I think people are responding positively to that.
You talk about a unity of mission. Do you have a unity of terms and conditions yet?
We're working through aligning our terms and conditions. We've made progress on, for example, pay. So our country-based colleagues overseas are on different scales in the places where there were both DFID officers and high commissions and embassies, and we're unifying those. We've unified pay scales at senior levels. We'll move to unify the delegated grades over the period ahead. There's a complex set of other terms and conditions. I think there's something like 200 in total, and we're working to unify those over the next period.
I think the committee was slightly surprised to hear that you're advertising a post in New York that has just been filled on DFID terms and conditions, an organisation that hasn't existed for a year.
So while we produce unified terms and conditions, people need to be on a set of terms and conditions. So at the moment we're going through the process of creating a single set of terms and conditions.
When do you expect that to be complete?
Absolutely complete will take the next couple of years, because it's complex bringing together 200 different terms and conditions. When will the
last person to be hired on old terms and conditions be hired?
I can't give you an absolute answer to that.
Chris?
Just a quick question about humanitarian aid. The UK government has promised 220 million to Ukraine and surrounding countries. Why has only 60 million so far been spent?
Well, we've allocated the full 220 million to organisations, but it gets spent over time. And I believe the latest figure is around 100 million. So those organisations, once they've been allocated the funding, then need to deploy that funding over time. So it's all of the 220 million has been allocated.
You said, you were talking about authoritarian regimes earlier, and you've said that the UK should be a robust counterweight to authoritarian regimes, and that we are ending our dependency on authoritarian regimes for energy. How would you describe the Gulf states?
I would describe the Gulf states as partners of the United Kingdom. We're currently negotiating a trade deal with the GCC. Now, is every country that we work with exactly in line with United Kingdom policy on everything. No, they're not, but they are important allies of the United Kingdom.
Hang on, Mohammed bin Salman, responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, no? Yeah?
What I would say is that Saudi Arabia
Was he responsible?
is an important partner of the United Kingdom.
81 executions all on one day in Saudi Arabia. And you don't think that that's an authoritarian regime?
What I'm focused on is making sure that we are dealing with the major threats to the world. The number one threat we're dealing with at the moment is the threat from Russia. In order to do that, we need to make sure that we have alternative energy sources. And one of the key sources of energy is the Gulf region. We're not dealing in a perfect world. We're dealing in a world where we need to make difficult decisions. And I think it is right that we build that closer trading relationship with the Gulf states.
If a country is an authoritarian regime, it's fine to do business with it as long as the authoritarianism is only within its own borders. Is that right?
What we're facing with Russia is a regime that is actively seeking to invade sovereign nations and create a greater Russia, recreate the former Soviet Union. What we're seeing with China...
Yeah, but we went hand in cap to them for 12 years, and now
wrong.
we're doing the same with Saudi Arabia.
Well, I think that was wrong, the approach that was taken to Russia by the West. It was wrong.
In the Gulf trade document that you just published, you say the government will continue to hold those who violate human rights to account. How are you doing that in the Gulf states at the moment?
Well, these issues are raised regularly with the relevant ministers and leaders who we meet in the Gulf states.
You
and
have
what
personally?
our aim, I have personally, yes.
Well, your spokesman said that you hadn't. So what's the last human rights issue that you raised with a Gulf state leader?
I'd have to come back to the committee on the precise timing of that, but I certainly
anything.
have
Just
raised
tell us
it.
anything that you've said on
well,
human rights.
Well, I certainly have raised it when I was in...
Go on, tell us one now.
I'm just trying to remember my most recent visit, but I can assure you I have raised it, and I will write to you with the details.
You can't remember a single human rights issue that you've raised with a Gulf state leader?
Well, I've raised particular issues when I've been in the Gulf about
name
human
one.
rights issues. Well, I'm not going to go into all the details of private conversations, which I will come back to you on in due course.
I'll name one. Thanks, Jim.
Liam.
Your government has come under some criticism for the cut in support for overseas development. We have, however, had new resources. Do you know how much the UK has had in special drawing rights from the International Monetary Fund? It's £19 billion. It's one of the most significant increases in resource that we could deploy. What conversations have you had with the Treasury about rechanneling those special drawing rights?
Frequent discussions with the Treasury on that issue.
When was the last discussion?
I think it was in the early spring in the wake of the spending review.
What's your personal target for the fraction of special drawing rights that we should be recycling?
I don't have a personal target for the fraction of drawing rights that we should be targeting, but I am clear that it is an opportunity for us to find funding to help support projects.
Should we be rechanneling more than we are today?
As I say, we are in discussions with the Treasury about just that.
Do you know how much we have recycled so far?
No, I don't.
About 20 to 25% of £19 billion. It's the biggest single increase that we could make in development aid this year. But you don't know what the figure is, and you don't know what your target is.
As I've said, we have regular discussions, and in fact we continue to be in discussions with the Treasury about the overall overseas development budget. And we are trying to secure funding for various projects, in particular to make sure we've got funding for Ukraine. And I think as we go forward, one of my big focuses is Ukrainian reconstruction and seeing what we can do in terms of SDRs for those projects.
So we've just been handed £19 billion of special drawing rights. What is your target? What's your personal objective for what fraction of that we should be reaching?
My objective is to secure funding for the Ukrainian reconstruction, and those are regular discussions I have with the Treasury. And we negotiate on a case-by-case basis with the Treasury, who own the policy for special drawing rights.
But you don't have a personal view on what fraction of
well,
the
I'm not going to go
billion.
into the details of my negotiations with the Treasury, which are ongoing. I don't know, Philip, if you want to.
Too low?
So as the Foreign Secretary says, this is an ongoing discussion with the Treasury about how the SCRs are used and how they're scored.
It sounds like that you've cut development spending, you've been given £19 billion, and you don't have a strategy for maximising how much of this new £19 billion we're recycling.
Neil, you wanted to go?
We've moved on slightly, but I can come back to that. It was around the departmental merger and the extension that you touched on around Ukraine work, but also Afghanistan. In March, you wrote to the Prime Minister to ask for 1,000, I think it was, additional staff for the department to help manage. What was the answer?
So as you know, there's a process across the whole of the government around the size of the civil service, and the Foreign Secretary and I are engaged, as we've been asked to be by the Cabinet Office and the Treasury in that process. We've begun those discussions. They haven't concluded. That's the process by which decisions will be taken around the overall size of the civil service
So
and
individual said they want to cut the number.
Individual
And
departments.
you've asked for some more. What's the situation
So
right now?
I'm explaining where we are in terms of numbers of people in the department. There's a
Have you got any more yet?
there's a civil service wide process which hasn't concluded. That will answer the question about the long-term size of the
When do you expect
department. On that process, there'll be a conclusion in the autumn. It's a centrally run process.
Sorry, Sir Philip.
So
Sorry, Sir Philip. If it's in autumn, we can come back to it then. But in the meantime, what is happening to civil servants out there who are being tasked with the work that you would like that 1,000 extra to be doing? You've asked for that 1,000 quotient. So what's been deprioritised in order to deliver the work of that 1,000 people that you've not got yet?
So the process will conclude in the autumn. In the meantime, we are recruiting additional staff because we knew that particularly at the less senior levels we didn't have enough staff, and that recruitment process is happening now, and additional staff will be coming into the department over the next few months as we conclude those processes. The Foreign Secretary set out how we've restructured to make sure we are prioritising what we need to do in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that we are, in the way the Foreign Secretary described, absolutely focused on that, absolutely focused in a more coherent way around how we lead our development work. The international economics work that Kumar leads, being clear about our leadership of geographic work.
So what was deprioritised?
So we're focused on the top priorities as the Foreign Secretary set out, Russia's invasion of Ukraine primarily.
Okay, so what was deprioritised? You're not answering. You're saying that you've taken on these additional priorities and you've asked for extra staff to do it, but you're not saying what's been deprioritised. It's a really simple question.
So clearly, as we look forward, as it were, there's the work you do on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's other areas of work that we get to when we can.
I'm trying to help.
Perhaps the Foreign Secretary would like to help you.
So as Philip says, we have moved staff into Russia, Ukraine. We've moved staff into geopolitics, so supporting on the G7 work around that. I mean, we have gained some efficiencies in doing that. I think it's important to point out. So I was talking about development. There's quite a lot of disparate teams across the organisation. We've now put them, into a single area or a single directorate, and that has created more coherence in the organisation. And in terms of geographical areas, I've highlighted Russia, Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific. We've got a strong tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. we also are making sure that our development aid in Africa is going up over time. So those are the areas that we're prioritising. I mean, in terms of staff numbers, I'm sure we could write to you
Perhaps,
on...
Foreign Secretary, you could tell me where you might have drawn down from. Have you drawn down from South America? Have you drawn down from Asia? Have you drawn down from America, Australia, Europe? I mean, I can keep going if you like.
We also have extra staff who've come over from the Cabinet Office to support the NIP
You've drawn down
work.
no staff from any other areas at all?
I mean, overall...
So, overall, Chair, what we did is, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we had prepared an immediate 24/7 crisis response. We drew across the organisation as the situation through the immediate response became clearer. We then wanted to make sure we had an enhanced effort. Again, we drew across the organisation. We looked at where we could find additional people. We've done that across the whole.
Just
the whole
delighted
department.
that the Foreign Office is clearly the department on the mount, and every time you look for loaves and fishes, you reach into the basket and there's enough to feed the 5,000. It's fantastic. It's a remarkable achievement. Bob, would you like to?
Do you mind if I just ask a quick question, just on the changing of contracts? Why is it taking so long to change people's contracts over? Because it is something, and I rightly see FCO folks who are not on as generous terms as people who've come over from DFID. So why is it taking so long just to get a sort of single contract for anybody working in the FCDO? Because you're saying this might go on for another 2 years.
I think there's two reasons. One is it's not just the salary and the pay scales, which we are moving to unify as quickly as we can. There's obviously an affordability questions in how you do that. There's then a wider package of quite complicated allowances which were different between the two departments, so we need to work out how best to do that. So in some cases you look at, for example, pay, and a former DFID colleague might be paid in basic salary terms more than the former FCO colleague, but the wider allowance package will have been different. So it's the wider package of allowances that takes longer to work through.
Do you think that process would be quicker in the private sector, or do you think that a private sector company would take the same amount of time to work through these issues?
So I've discussed this a lot with our non-executive directors, who all have deep private sector experience, and what they say is that this is a complex process. It always takes time.
Can I just ask a tiny follow-up just on what we were talking about? And I'm not trying to be critical, but because you've got such a draw on resources on Russia and Ukraine, I know that you would want to say, we are, the South Africa, Middle East, all this stuff we're still firing on all cylinders. But because you are so focused, for very good reason, on Russia and Ukraine, the day-to-day work in other areas, without wishing to be critical, do you think it is suffering, or do you think you're doing more with less? And how long can you continue to do more with less before the day-to-day or before your other ambitions as the FCDO become constricted, because you've got to focus resources, either for the Foreign Secretary or for Mr. Philip?
So ultimately, there is always a point at which you can't do things in any organisation, because there's an infinite amount we could do as the Foreign Office. So we have to focus. I do think by creating this geopolitical area, we are now more efficient in some of the ways we deal with issues. So we are able to look at, for example, we've recently signed a security and CT agreement with Indonesia. We're now able to look at doing that with other partners around the world. So we're able to read across, and my observation about the Foreign Office historically is it's been quite siloed. So we've sometimes reinvented the wheel, or we've not read across. So China, for example, we've got a China department, but a lot of the work we need to do on China is working with our G7 allies to challenge China collectively. So that's better done through our geopolitics area. So I think we're doing things differently, but of course you're right, Bob, that there will be areas where we can't do as much. And there is a certain amount of reducing some of the activities which weren't necessarily generating as much value as well.
I mean, can you just enlighten us as to what some of those activities were? What would have been a sort of medium-term priority, which has now sort of fallen down the scale, just because of the amount of significant additional work that's now being done either on China or on Russia and Ukraine?
I think the way I would answer it is, I mean, firstly, to go back to your sustainable question, I think there is an issue around the overall shape of the and resourcing of the department in terms of people. To go back to the question about the additional 1,000, in a sense, you have, and it was true of the two legacy departments that for a lot of their time were doing business as usual, and in a world where I think we are seeing more frequent, very significant crises, how we have contingency to respond to those, I think, is an important question for how we're organised in the future. On the prioritisation point, I think what we haven't done is said we're stopping completely X or Y. So we haven't got a list of things. What we have done is looked across the whole department to resource the increased effort. So, there will be bilateral relationships where in an ideal world we'll be doing more, if you like, kind of opportunity, proactive work, and we now have a reduced resource on that and are just keeping relationships going because we need to put resource into the response to Russia-Ukraine.
Can I just ask very specifically about an area where you've committed to do extra work? We're all aware of the Rwanda policy and the oversight that has been promised into Rwanda to support those. What extra resources have you put into Rwanda?
I'd have to come back to you on the precise details, Chair. I think what we've done is used our excellent High Commissioner and his team and their time as the resource in support of the Home Office led third country asylum partnership. I would have to absolutely check whether I don't think we've put in additional. We've then obviously at the UK end, as you'd expect, as FCDO, played our part in the cross-HMG work on this priority area.
The commitment, I just asked because the commitment was to have oversight in Kigali of those refugees who'd been sent to Rwanda, and I'm just wondering what commitment you made as part of that agreement, because presumably there was some consular responsibility as part of that. I'm sure the Home Secretary would have asked for support because, of course, this is a High Commission, not a government department. What commitment
and our High
did you
Commission
make?
is very closely involved.
I'm sure. I'm just wondering what
is happening there, and it's worth saying that Rwanda is a country where we are building a series of partnerships with Rwanda.
Absolutely,
on a number of issues.
I understand that. I don't wish to sort of be in any way critical. That's a home office policy, and we're not going into it. I'm just wondering. You must have made a commitment to the Home Secretary. What did she ask for, and what have you committed to do in the High Commission in Kigali in order to support the promise made by the British government to have oversight of refugees, supposedly numbered in the hundreds, who will be at some point in the imminent future being
my
Rwanda?
understanding is that would be led by Home Office officials rather than FCDO officials. I mean, and this is for all of the migration work we do, Home Office officials lead in terms of assessing accommodation. All of those types of issues is very much Home Office led. So we provide diplomatic support, but we wouldn't be providing that type of oversight.
What preparations have you made to provide diplomatic support to how many Home Office officials in Kigali?
I'd have to.
So the Chair will have to come back to you on the numbers. I think the key thing is the High Commissioner and his team have put at the disposal of the Home Office, their diplomatic influence and access and support as we've had our discussions with the government of Rwanda.
And it's worth saying, I mean, one of the points I've focused on as Foreign Secretary is empowering our missions more. So particularly in development aid, giving them larger development budgets, having more decisions taken at country level, because they are in a better position to decide which projects are going to add value than people sitting in Whitehall. And that is a better way of delivering that is less bureaucratic than what we've had before. So yes, there are areas where we are having to prioritise, but broadly speaking, we're also making our network work better. And I think we're getting more out of our staff on the front line as a result.
I'm just going to come to Neil Coyle in a second to go on to more on Rwanda, but before I do you support financial targets for foreign aid?
What do you mean by that?
It's 0.5%. Do you support financial targets for foreign aid?
Yes.
You do? Okay.
Yes.
Do you think that the foreign aid target should go back to 0.7%?
We have pledged that it will go back to 0.7.
Indeed, I'm just wondering what you think.
Well, the answer is I always agree with government policy, Chairman.
There we go. Delighted to hear it. Let's go to Rwanda.
Yeah,
Hopefully.
maybe it's a bit of jet lag or something, but I'm really concerned about this. So is the FCDO's position that the Home Office will have staff on the ground to handle the new partnership?
The partnership was signed by the Home Secretary with her counterpart in the Rwandan government. And of course, the United Kingdom and Rwanda have a very close relationship, which the Foreign Office is responsible for. But this is a Home Office policy, which we are working with the Home Office to deliver in Rwanda.
So the UK-Rwanda Migration and Economic Development Partnership is a Home Office policy.
Yes.
You're quite happy for the Home Secretary to be leading on economic development partnership contracts with other governments? Are you out of a job?
No, believe me, I have plenty to do. And I have, numerous colleagues working internationally. So I have the Energy Secretary signing energy partnerships with other countries. I have the Justice Secretary, working on the International Criminal Court. That's the way the Foreign Office is a department that delivers in certain areas, particularly in international development, but we have other delivery departments, such as the Home Office, who are the experts on dealing with migration, and we also have the Business Department, who are the experts on dealing with energy. So we work collaboratively across government. We were fully involved in this policy development, but in terms of delivery, it's a Home Office responsibility.
It sounds like chaos. So when the UN
it's a coherent government policy.
When the UN say this is an illegal policy, unlawful policy, do you say go and talk to the Home Secretary as your subordinate, as part of your team? It sounds like in your recent description just then.
I don't recognise the premise of that question. This is
UN
a perfectly legal policy that this government is pursuing. And all, I'm sure, as you're aware, Mr. Coyle, all government policies are cleared cross-government, getting the support of all government departments. So we've worked very closely with the Home Office on this policy.
And as the Foreign Secretary for the United Kingdom, no country has raised concerns with you about the legality of that policy?
No, in fact, what has been raised with me by foreign counterparts is wanting to learn from the UK's policy so that they can engage in similar arrangements.
And as things stand, there's absolutely no plan to provide additional resource or staff from the Foreign Office to help run on the ground in Rwanda the operations.
I think, to be clear, what I said was we'll have to come back to give chapter and verse on the arrangements for putting in place at the High Commission. Exactly. We work in partnership with the Home Office.
Right. And then on the money that this is spending, who is responsible for the £120 million aid package? I mean, that should be FCDO, right? Who's overseeing that £120 million deal?
That's the Home Office.
The Home Office for overseeing the aid package.
The ODA budget is not just spent by the Foreign Office. The ODA budget is spent by other government departments, and it's overall managed by the Treasury, which is back to Mr. Burns' point earlier.
So the 0.5, the reduction to 0.5% to 0.7, is the £120 million?
It's not ODA.
It's what, sorry?
It's not ODA. It's not ODA money. It's not coming from the development budget.
So with the increase in the inevitable increase, the justified increase in support required to deal with Ukraine, Afghanistan, and also this unlawful policy in Rwanda, none of that is included in the 0.5%. What was the purpose of reducing to 0.5%? Was it just tokenistic?
The overall ODA budget is 0.5%.
None of this additional aid.
And for example, the Ukraine funding is within the 0.5%. I mean, the budget that the Permanent Secretary is talking about is a Home Office budget. So the budget we control is, I can give you the numbers if that's helpful, but 5 billion for 21-22, that goes up to 9.2 billion for 22-23, and it goes by 2025 it's up to 9.9 billion. But that is the ODA allocations that are down to the Foreign Office, and which we are responsible for.
Thank you. Royston.
Thank you, Chairman. Foreign Secretary, thank you for coming to see us today. Can I talk a bit about state hostage taking and particularly the release of hostages recently from Iran? We've had two foreign secretaries, former foreign secretaries, come before us and talk about the outstanding IMS debt. What were the 5 conditions required by the Treasury to allow that IMS debt to Iran to be repaid?
Well, the core point is that the debt had to be used for humanitarian purposes. So that was the key requirement.
And that was the only requirement?
Well, that was the key requirement as far as we were concerned. That was the potential issue for the Treasury.
The Treasury didn't have any other requirements, just that one, as long as you could show that it was only ever going to be used for humanitarian aid, then the money could be released, and that was the only stumbling block throughout then.
We'll have to ask the Treasury if there were more requirements as far as they were concerned, but as far as we were concerned, that was the key area that we had to have assurance on.
So what conditions then, that condition then specifically, what changed? How did you demonstrate then that by paying that debt, it would only be used for humanitarian aid? Because it's very difficult, isn't it? Because if you release money for a particular issue, it still allows the regime to backfill in another way, doesn't it? So how did you demonstrate that, categorically to Treasury that was the only way that debt was going to be used when it was repaid?
One of the issues here is I'm not able to tell the committee, because it is confidential, about the precise route that we used. That's the issue. So I'm unable to share that with you, regrettably. But what I can tell you is the assurances we received about the route were enough to reassure the Treasury and get it signed off by the Treasury at all levels.
And did you have discussions with the US government about the repayment?
Well, I talk to the US government regularly about many issues, including the IMS debt and indeed the issues of the unfairly detained people in Iran.
And what about other detainees in Iran now? Is there any progress on securing their release?
Well, we continue to press the Iranian government for the release of all detainees. And in the case of some detainees, the families do not want us to reveal who is detained. But I can assure you we continue to talk to the Iranian government, and we continue to work to secure the release of all detainees.
And then hostage taking more broadly. We were in Washington last week and we met with Ambassador Roger Carstens, who's a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, and he gave us a really quite thorough briefing about how the US deal with hostage taking. How do we deal in general with that? How do we deal with families? How do we deal with the extended issues of when a person is taken, and how do we, what mechanism do we use to try and secure their release?
In terms of the specific cases I've been involved in, we spend a lot of time lobbying governments directly to secure the release, and doing that by means of persuasion. And our teams have recently secured the release of 5 people from Afghanistan. For example, we also secured the release of Nazanin and Anousheh from Iran. But we take a case-by-case approach on all of these issues, because it does depend on the government and it depends on the specific circumstance. In the case of Iran, we had 2 very clear irritants in our bilateral relationship. Number 1, the detainees. Number 2, the IMS debt. And I agreed with Minister Abdollahian, the Iranian Foreign Minister, that we would deal with those issues in parallel. So that's the approach we took with Iran. We took a different approach with Afghanistan. We are currently working on various other cases around the world. And what we're also doing is working with our G7 partners on a more unified approach to unfair detention. In particular, Canada is leading on this initiative. There's going to be a conference later on this year. But what we want is more of an all-for-one, one-for-all approach, so we can't be picked off against other countries, and we have a common approach to detainee taking.
The special envoy in the US for hostage taking is the point of contact, and he will speak to families, he will walk them through the process, he will make them understand and accept that this could be a long process and that not much is going to happen overnight. Do we have a single point of contact like that?
I mean, we have an excellent team at the Foreign Office dealing with this.
So what we do, and I think we've arranged for our consular director to brief you about how the process works in practice in more detail. I'm sorry that hasn't happened yet for diary reasons, but we have in our consular director we have what we call a special cases team. So where it's not a run-of-the-mill case which just needs standard consular assistance, they'll be responsible. They'll take responsibility for liaison with the family, but they'll also crucially work very closely with a relevant geographic part of the department and the overseas embassy or high commission, depending on where someone might be held, to make sure that we're being kind of, if you like, the totality of UK effort behind a particular case, and it's fully coordinated, involves obviously ministers as necessary. But this special cases team will be the ones responsible for staying over the long term in touch with families.
Just one final small one, please. They were very candid with us about how many hostages they were looking at in the US and how they had categorised those, because some weren't categorised as hostages in the first place, so they have a process to go through it. Do you have a similar process, and how many people are currently deemed to be hostages from this country?
So I think we need to sort of be clear around language. So there are hostages in the sense of hostages held by terrorist groups. I think you're using the term in a broader sense in terms of the workload of the special cases.
People that have been detained and are not allowed to come home.
If we're talking about the work of the special cases team, I'll make sure that the director, when she briefs you, comes with the numbers of their workload.
Thank you, Chairman.
Just to quickly follow up on Royston, the foremost job of the Foreign Office is to keep British nationals safe abroad. So I'm surprised that you don't want to tell us the number of people, and it's not just terrorist groups that hold people hostage, it's hostile states as well. So how many British nationals are currently being held hostage around the world?
I don't have that number in front of me.
But you can see why that concerns me.
Okay.
So I'll make sure that the director, when she briefs the committee, comes with the numbers.
An allied question. Gholam Reza Zihahi, who's the former head of Evin prison in Iran, which is where Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was held. He was responsible for the inhuman and degrading treatment of prisoners at the prison. He's sanctioned by the EU, but not by the UK. Why?
Well, that's something I'm very happy to look into, Chris. I will look into that. I was not aware of that.
It will be under the Magnitsky Sanctions rather than, obviously, Russian sanctions. But
let me have a look
okay.
at that. I'm happy
thanks.
to look at that.
Just to follow Alicia's question, how many dual nationals are in Iran at risk of the death sentence for example, alleged spying? How many of our fellow citizens are facing that threat today?
I don't think it's helpful for us to talk about numbers of people held in Iran. As the Foreign Secretary said earlier, families often ask us not to raise it.
Asking for how many Iranian British dual nationals are at risk of the death sentence for alleged spying today. Sorry.
Pick up on private military company.
I don't think it's helpful for us to go into numbers.
It's not true at all.
I think the committee wants to know.
It is helpful.
Is it not
I think we could give you a private briefing, but one of the issues that we have with unfairly detained personnel is getting these issues resolved and making them very public, and not necessarily it doesn't help help
showing the
achieve
extent
the
of the
outcomes we
problem
want. And
does.
our absolute priority is getting these British nationals
That's
released.
not what Richard Radcliffe told us. That's not what many of the other families have told us. But we can come back
Well,
to
I'm
that.
very...
There's clearly difference of opinion here, Foreign Secretary.
Numbers. There is, but the way that we secured Nazanin's release and Anousheh's release was through a lot of quite low-key work to get it done. And sometimes publicity doesn't help. Now, there are different cases and different governments are influenced in different ways. And where we feel it is helpful, we will take that approach. But, for example, in securing the release of detainees from Afghanistan, that was done in a very quiet fashion and was successful. So I just think we have to be careful not to give publicity to some of these cases where the malign regime wants the publicity. That's the issue we face.
Even if the families would like the numbers to be known.
Well, if the families, it's a different issue if the families want to publicise it, and I would never ever second guess somebody whose family has been detained. They absolutely have a right to publicise their case. I'm simply saying where the families have requested us not to publicise it, and where we think there is a good route to get this done in a relatively low-key manner, that is the approach that we will take. And this is the discussion. I think the private briefing will be very helpful with our director, because this is the discussion that we often have internally when we're trying to deal with these cases.
Foreign Secretary, we weren't asking for names or details. We were asking merely for numbers, and I don't think that's an unreasonable question. So I agree with almost everything else you've said, but I don't agree.
I'm very
with
happy.
numbers.
What I'm saying is I'm happy that we provide that to the committee on a private basis. That's what I'm saying.
Should Iran be taken off the foreign terrorist list?
Sorry, say that again?
Iran at the moment is deemed to be supporting terrorism. Is that still your view?
Yes.
Henry.
Foreign Secretary, thanks for joining us. Moving on to private military companies.
Sorry, just for a brief second, before you do that, there are, as you know, British citizens who have been detained in Luhansk and Donetsk in, frankly, kangaroo courts under Putin's control. What support are you able to offer them?
We are offering direct support to the families. We've been in touch with the families. I spoke this morning to the Ukrainian Prime Minister about these specific detainees. You're right, they're prisoners of war. They were legitimately fighting for the Ukrainian army, and we're doing all we can to secure their release.
And just to be absolutely clear, under the Geneva Convention, under the Protocols of War, they are absolutely legal, lawful combatants in a uniformed armed force for a recognised state. There's no debate about that.
That's absolutely correct.
Thank you.
So moving on to illegal combatants. You recently gave evidence, I understand, to the International Development Committee with regard to the Wagner Group and the mercenary activities that they are engaged in destabilising a number of states in Africa. What is the UK government doing to address and tackle the threat and the destabilising nature of such groups?
Well, the Wagner Group is a very concerning organisation. It is destabilising countries, and it is a wing of the Russian state, essentially. That's what we're seeing. And we're seeing Wagner Group personnel also being used in the field in Ukraine. So we have sanctioned the Wagner Group as an entity. We did that in March this year. And we are working with our allies, and it's a regular discussion at the G7 about what more we can do to collectively target the activities of the Wagner Group. But the other point I would make is that we need to be providing security alternatives to governments around the world. And it's a similar point really to the point I was making about economic security. if countries want to see their security improved, we need to be working with them on counter-terrorism agreements, on areas like joint military exercises, intelligence support, so they are not pulled in to the orbit of the malign activities of the Wagner Group or anything else. So it's not good enough just to say we don't like what the Wagner Group is doing. We also need to be collectively, as the free world, providing alternatives to help countries bolster their own security.
And if I could ask you to expand on that a little bit more, first of all, which countries are you particularly concerned about with regards to private military organisations, and giving an alternative choice to those countries, as you've just been articulating, what does that look like, particularly working perhaps in partnership with our allies?
I mean, in terms of the countries that we believe that Wagner Group has been running deployments to, Syria, Sudan, the Central African Republic, Mozambique, Libya and Mali. So those are all countries where we believe these deployments are. The point I was making about strengthening our security arrangements is not necessarily with countries who have the Wagner Group active at present. It's also preventative. By having a positive security relationship with the United Kingdom or one of our G7 and NATO allies, that helps prevent infiltration by the likes of the Wagner Group into those countries. And we've, as I said, we've signed cooperation agreements with Indonesia. Very recently, we work as part of the Five Powers Agreement with countries like Malaysia in Southeast Asia. We are in exploratory talks with a number of African countries also about security partnerships. But this is, I think, an absolute imperative for the free world, as well as challenging the Belt and Road Initiative and other initiatives of economic coercion. We also need to be looking at how we collaborate more closely on security.
Thank you.
Can I pick up on some of that? You've spoken about a few of the countries you're worried about. I mean, one of the countries that I think many of us are worried about at the moment is Libya, which you'll be all too well aware is one of the main trafficking routes for illegal migration, and is tragically seeing huge numbers of people effectively trafficked into slavery, sexual abuse and extreme violence, very often death, on the routes that lead up to the Mediterranean coast. What engagement have you had recently with Libya?
Well, Minister Cleverly has had significant engagement with Libya. He's visited very recently. I don't have the most recent date, but we are in regular touch, urging that elections take place in Libya. That's very important.
The reason I raise it while we're talking about private military companies is the person who is certainly has a reasonable claim to be the current Prime Minister of Libya has spoken publicly about the threat of the Wagner Group and the different Russian mercenary elements in Libya. Have you met with him to discuss it? I believe his name is Bashara?
I haven't, no.
You haven't, okay. I know he was meeting with various people in Parliament last week or the week before, so I just wondered whether he'd had the opportunity.
No. And what we want as the United Kingdom government is we want an election to take place so that we have proper process in place in Libya.
Do you want an amendment to the international law on mercenaries? Because the Geneva Conventions, it's 6 clauses you have to fulfil for somebody to be termed a mercenary, and then it's really difficult to get any kind of conviction.
It's an interesting idea.
You don't know?
I don't know. It's an interesting idea which I will look into.
Could you write to us?
Can I just come back briefly to Libya again? Given that we've been speaking about this year the threat of hydrocarbons splitting the NATO alliance and splitting the European partnership that is supporting the coalition that is helping Ukraine, given that we're quite rightly, I think, focused on illegal migration and the influence that it could have on not just the United Kingdom but actually European cooperation, and given that we've been speaking about food security and the threat that that could have to sub-Saharan Africa and indeed many parts of North Africa in terms of unrest. And let's not forget price rises that led or were one of the triggers of the Arab Spring in 2011 were significantly lower than now. Are you worried about the direction of travel in Libya? And do you not think that this would be one of those areas where the UK's active involvement would have major repercussions, not just for illegal migration to our country, but the stability of Europe and the possible trafficking of not just a few million people as came out of Syria in recent years in 2014 and 15, but actually tens, possibly even 100 or so million people moving from sub-Saharan Africa north?
Of course, I am extremely concerned about the global energy crisis that we're facing and the food crisis. And the UK attended the Food Crisis Summit last week. We're putting more money into support, and we're also working very hard to help get the grain out of Odessa and out of Ukraine overall. So those are absolutely key concerns. We are pushing on action in Libya. We do think the way forward is to have this election, and we need the people to get round the table and talk to make that progress, and we are playing an active role, and James Cleverly is very much leading on that.
May I just ask, I come back to, there was one of the two principal actors in the Libyan scene who was in London last week. Was it a policy decision not to meet him, or was it simply timing?
We need to make sure that we are speaking to both sides in Libya. So it wasn't I was out of the country, so
no, but sure, but you have several ministers and you have many officials.
It wasn't a policy decision.
He was here on a private visit, Chair, and I think officials do meet him as part of our engagement with the whole spectrum of Libyan actors as we try in support of the UN-led efforts to secure political progress, working closely with the P3, France, the US, but also Germany and Italy.
But I think it is important that we're even-handed.
I completely accept that.
That's very important from our perspective.
You meet both of them.
And believe me, if there was any action that we could take that would resolve the situation in Libya, we would take it. But what is important is that the parties get around the table and deal with this issue.
Forgive me, but we're talking about stopping a few hundred people from coming to the UK who we're going to send to Rwanda, and here we've got literally tens of thousands, possibly even millions crossing from Libya. It would strike me that, stopping the leaking tap while ignoring the raging torrent would seem an unwise thing to do. But anyway, we can move on from that. Alicia, you wanted to...
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to briefly touch on Bosnia. Parliament and the Foreign Office under your leadership have been very strong voice on Balkans, which is absolutely right. How are we ensuring that the Balkans isn't forgotten given the immediate crisis? The Nato Summit coming up, for example, today, given that the EU quite clearly isn't doing what it needs to do in terms of focusing on the Balkans, bringing them in. And my particular concern is that Dodik only a few weeks ago said that Putin had told him we are not leaving our friends and that the Serbs are just waiting for time. So given Republika Srpska's quite open desire to restart the Bosnian war, will you be asking EU leaders to join the UK and US in the sanctions regime that you have put forward?
So the answer is yes. I have urged our EU allies to follow us on the sanctions. I recently visited Sarajevo. It is very important that we don't allow the situation to drift and to go back to what was an appalling time in the country. I met the presidents of Bosnia and made that very clear to them in the meeting. I'm also concerned, as you say, about Serbia. I was very pleased that Sergei Lavrov's flight was prevented from entering the country, but I'm concerned about malign Russian influence in the region, as well as economic coercion by China. So we've recently seen a coal-fired power station funded by China in the country, and this is why, as well as providing security assistance, which the United Kingdom is doing, and I saw some of the equipment we're supplying in Bosnia when I was there, we also need to provide more economic support. And I announced a £100 million of UK-backed investment by 2025 and opening new UKEF credit lines from Bosnia Herzegovina, but we also need to see our allies act. And we recently discussed this at the G7 meeting. I know that the Germans are keen to do more, the United States are keen to do more, and we are pushing that very hard because whilst the war in Ukraine is the absolute immediate issue, we can't have other parts of Europe being destabilised by malign Russian activity.
Moving to a very different part of the world, looking at the Pacific, I really welcome the British international investment effort and the G7 efforts around this and making it an economic power to counter hostile influence. My question is, when we talk about in the Indo-Pacific strategy and the tilt, there's a lot of focus on the Indo. What successes, if any, have we had in the Pacific with small states?
We are doing a lot of work on refocusing our investment offer into the Pacific states, particularly working with Australia and New Zealand, who have very close relationships with those states. And at the Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit last week, I met both Australia and New Zealand and a number of the Pacific states to talk about how we can partner on investments into that area. We've also recently signed up to a joint initiative with the United States, with Australia, New Zealand and Japan, Pacific Blue Partnerships. I hope I've got that name right. But it's all about providing support to those small island states in the Pacific. So this is an area where the G7 and our allies like Australia and New Zealand really understand that we have to step up.
I think the committee would be very keen to see a specific strategy or specific plan for what we're going to see in terms of small island state engagement rather than the bigger players that we're used to having that relationship with, if that's possible.
Well, I hope that you will be able to see more very soon, because Jacinda Ardern is going to be visiting London next week, and we're working particularly closely with New Zealand on this issue, so I hope we'll be able to say more in the coming weeks.
Fantastic. And my final one, Chairman, was atrocity prevention is something I have raised time and time again on this committee since I joined it. We're obviously living through a real period where we are seeing continual atrocities on different levels, hostile state actors, but also non-state actors. Is the conflict centre delivering what it should be doing? And what are the efforts that have been meaningfully put in place, Sir Philip, under your leadership to improve our atrocity prevention capabilities? And as part of that, have you had a chance to consider the recommendations of our Afghanistan report? Because that specifically looked at crisis planning and administration around preventing atrocities. And what efforts have you made to put in place those recommendations?
On the Afghanistan report, I've read it, we've considered it very carefully, and the government will reply in the normal way. I mean, as you know, and I wrote to the chair, I think it was back in March, we did, in light of our experiences last year, conduct a very thorough internal lessons learning process on our Afghanistan response and what that meant for our crisis capability going forwards, and we took many of those lessons into the way we organised ourselves to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As you know and you've said, we do have the Office for Conflict Stabilisation and Mediation, and that's established and is absolutely working across the whole of the department and our global network on our atrocity prevention work. It's looking at how we can create a dedicated hub to basically take a comprehensive approach to this sort of work in priority countries. It's developing tools like early warning, how and who we engage with, both bilaterally and multilaterally, and what sort of programmatic support we can put in place.
Forgive me, you said we need to look at how we create a hub, but when I was elected I fought for a conflict centre to be established, and that's been established. So why are we looking to create a hub when we already have the conflict centre?
The conflict centre looks across the whole range of conflict issues, not just atrocity prevention clearly is a key part of that, but it's not the only part.
Okay, and so would you be able to assess that under your leadership the capabilities of the Foreign Office and its ability to tackle atrocities and prevent them has improved?
We haven't formally assessed that, so I'd be giving you an instinctive answer, but we are organised, as I say, around this office and looking in particular at this area.
Perhaps I'll put a marker down that, as I asked it last time, you can expect within the next year I'll be asking you again. So it'd be great to get an actual assessment, because this is the foremost job, is to keep people safe, and therefore that means preventing atrocities. So it would be very good to work out how we're going to assess it, because the Foreign Office shouldn't be doing any work unless it can assess whether or not it's achieving any outcomes or impact. I'd like to come back to China later, Chair, but I'll move on.
Absolutely, we can come back to China.
Yes, sorry,
go
could
on.
I've got the details of the partners in the Blue Pacific. So we put out a joint statement on the 25th of June. Australia, Japan, New Zealand, the UK and the United States. We are establishing partners in the Blue Pacific, and it has 3 aims: delivering results for the Pacific more effectively and efficiently, bolstering Pacific regionalism, and expanding opportunities for cooperation between the Pacific and the world. This is specifically on investing into those Pacific islands. So I'm happy to share more details of the initiative as they emerge.
That would be great. Is that connected to the Solomon Islands as well?
Yes, that's part of it.
And the response to China's increased presence?
Absolutely. We are actively looking at what we can do with New Zealand to invest more capability into the Solomons.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That came up quite a lot in the United States, as I'm sure you will imagine. Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Staying with the Indo-Pacific region, you have also recently spoken about the idea of there being a global NATO and how we might be able to, through partnership, help defend democracies in the Indo-Pacific region. How would you envisage that sort of organisation working? And what sort of partnerships are being worked on with regard to that? So, for example, you mentioned earlier on security arrangement with Indonesia, and obviously in response just now to the Chair on working with partners like New Zealand with regards to issues like the Solomon Islands.
Absolutely. So on the global NATO, in this week's new NATO strategic concept, there will be strong reference to China, because we recognise that China has built up its armed forces, that it's more active in the European area, and therefore NATO needs to be more actively looking at the threat from China. So this is a key step forward for NATO in terms of its actions on China. In terms of the relationships the UK has in the region, we're working with Australia and New Zealand on investment partnerships. We're also working with Japan on joint investment partnerships. I mentioned the partner in the Blue Pacific new initiative with all of those partners and the United States as well. And we also have a number of security arrangements. So AUKUS is very important. And at Kigali last week, I met the new Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, who is keen to push forward on all aspects of AUKUS, including Pillar 2, which is looking at cyber and technology, as well as Pillar 1, which are the submarines. We also want to build on the Five Powers relationship we have in the region with the likes of Malaysia, and also deepen our security relationship with Japan. So I'll be going to Japan fairly soon. We're in talks about closer security cooperation. So it's a network across the Asia-Pacific region, working with all of our key partners.
I'm very pleased to hear all of that. I think that is extremely important. So why has the China strategy been delayed?
I didn't know there was a...
Not. Sorry, could you elaborate on?
Well,
it was due to be published in June.
which was, I understand, due to be published imminently.
And there's also media reports about the fact it was brought to Cabinet and then was shelved. But we were told by officials a number of times that China strategy was due to be published in June.
I'm afraid we...
2 days.
Did it come to Cabinet? Was it shelved?
We have... we clearly... The government has regular internal discussions about China and about Russia and about key threats, essentially. Yeah. But there was no intention, as far as I'm aware, to publish a China strategy. We published the integrated review last year. We're now following up with the Network of Liberty work on expanding our partnerships in the region, both security and economic partnerships, as well as bolstering the G7 as an economic NATO. So we're doing all that, but there was no intention, as far as I'm aware, to publish a strategy on China.
But we do have a China strategy.
Yes, it's encapsulated within the integrated review.
Why can't it be published then? It's a key piece of foreign policy, surely, as you acknowledged, in terms of work with the G7 and other international partners. Surely there should be a clear articulated policy.
We do have a very clear articulated China policy, which I'm happy to talk through with this committee, but we didn't commit to publish a strategy.
Forgive me, there is a separate strategy that's been developed to sit underneath the integrated review, because I've met with the officials who are drafting the strategy and who've been working on it. So there is an intention to have a specific China subset strategy, which has been agreed cross-government and has been going around with the different government departments. The understanding was within Parliament that would be published. So if that isn't going to be published, has it now been finalised across all government departments, and did it come before the Cabinet, and was that shelved as a discussion?
I think it's in the process of being finalised. I think, as with many countries, Russia would be the other. As with many countries, including countries like Russia, clearly, a lot of our work is sensitive and is not easily put into the public domain.
We were repeatedly, with respect, we have been repeatedly promised a China strategy, which would be a really important part of the government's sort of foreign policy going forward, and we've been waiting for it. We've been promised it for over a year, and there have been statements made to that effect. So I think we're all a bit confused that all of a sudden.
I'm very happy to go away and look at this. I'm very clear that we have a China strategy, which I am currently implementing in everything I do. But in terms of a written document, I will go away and look at that, Bob.
Could you? Because one of the things that we were, when we asked specifically about China, really in the past two and a half years, we've been promised that a China strategy was coming, almost as a way of articulating the fact that we are looking again at our China strategy because of the change in our relationship with these authoritarian states like Russia, like China, because of the threat that they pose to the open order, and because of the changing nature and the increased authoritarianism in those states. So we were repeatedly given holding answers in light of expecting a China strategy.
I don't believe I've given you those holding answers. I don't believe I've said anything on that.
I completely appreciate there's a meta China strategy, which I think you're very clear in your direction on China. But Sir Philip, in terms of you saying it's almost finished, when did you last see the internal China strategy, which is cross-government and has been going around government departments for months now?
I would have to come back. I can't recall exactly when I last saw a document.
So how do you know it's almost finished?
I think I said it's in progress. So.
You said it's almost finalised. I think you're fine. It's very concerning that what should be probably the most important internal policy document for setting the direction of protecting our world order and our country between now and 2050, you don't know where it is, Sir Philip. I understand why it might not come to you yet, Foreign Secretary, although media seem to think it is, but it definitely exists, and it's...
The Foreign Secretary is very clearly set out, since she's been Foreign Secretary, the overall approach to China. That's what the FCDO is and has been implementing. There is obviously wider work across government led by the National Security Advisor, National Security Secretariat on things that go to the National Security Council, like China strategy.
Yeah, there is one specific strategy that gives civil servants actual outcomes and KPIs of what they deliver, the same way as we all knew what the strategy was on countering Daesh, but there was a specific strategy that was agreed across government. So I think it would be very helpful if you could write to us about where exactly we are with that, because we're all very clear it exists.
And it was cross-government. That was the point, that this was a cross-government... Sorry to interrupt, Alicia. Yeah. This was a cross-government strategy that you were working towards.
I think the China team might be sat in the Foreign Office a bit worried.
They're probably in the Home Office.
Okay, so we've got Schrodinger's strategy now. It both exists and doesn't exist at the same time. It's rather wonderful. Can we move on to Afghanistan just very briefly? It's been about a year now since the Taliban seized power. There are various aspects we could look at on this, and I'd just like to focus very narrowly on a single aspect. We have very, very clear consular and diplomatic relations with many neighbouring countries that have enormous importance to the United Kingdom, and you don't need me to go into them. How is our policy in Afghanistan in any way supporting our aims in neighbouring countries, and how is it supporting the needs of the Afghan people who today must feel frankly, pretty abandoned, except, as I noted today, by Chinese aid, which seems to be coming in extremely regularly.
We're working very, very closely with our international partners. We recently held a fundraising event to secure more aid into Afghanistan, and as I said, we've immediately had this issue with securing the release of British detainees from Afghanistan, but the situation continues to be appalling, and what has happened to women and girls' rights is appalling, and the UK is working with our allies to challenge the Taliban and to hold the Taliban to account.
Do we have any influence at all?
Well, I think the global community has influence collectively on Afghanistan and getting the Taliban to move in the right direction.
Okay. Where's sanctions?
Just a few sanctions, and the first one is one I mentioned to you yesterday, so I hope we might be able to clear this one up. On the 13th of April, you announced that 178 individuals will be sanctioned under the Russian sanctions regime. The press statement said Vladimir Evtushenkov, who's the chair and owner of PJSC Systema, was being sanctioned. That's a major Russian conglomerate with holdings in a wide range of industries. And that your statement said Systema and the companies it owns or controls are covered by this designation. Unfortunately, what he, of course, immediately did was he gave 10% of Systema to his son Felix, and so Systema is now not sanctioned. I just wonder whether you will now sanction Systema and, for that matter, Felix and Tatiana, who's his daughter, who runs an investment arm in London.
Do you want to answer?
No, happy to, Foreign Secretary. So on that one, I don't want to go into details on specific cases, but what I can say is we are looking at cases exactly like that one, and we're doing three things in that regard. First, we are looking to close loopholes as and when they arise in terms of trust structures and legal structures, as was used in that case. Second, we're working with OFSI and the NCA, who lead on the implementation and sanctions enforcement to make sure there isn't any evasion around it. And three, we're working with the business community, so we're working with banks and we're working with lawyers in order to make sure that loopholes it's not possible to take advantage.
I don't understand why you can't say whether you're going to sanction Systema, because you announced in April that you were intending to.
Sanctions have less effect if you announce them in advance.
But you announced it on the 13th of April, and now it's fallen apart.
But Kumar has been very clear. We are seeking to deal with loopholes.
Well, it's bizarre. All right. Your predecessor, moving on to Magnitsky Sanctions, sanctioned 105 individuals under the Magnitsky Sanctions, and I thought that was a great record. Excellent. You've only done 3 to date, and I know you've not been in post as long as he was there. But so far, the UK has sanctioned less than 15% of the perpetrators sanctioned by the US under its Magnitsky Sanctions regime in countries including Venezuela, Uganda, Rwanda, Cameroon, Sudan, the Philippines, Myanmar, Nicaragua, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, the DRC and China. Why are we doing so poorly on Magnitsky Sanctions?
First of all, on sanctions overall, we have sanctioned more individuals and entities concerning Russia than any other country in the world. As I explained at the last Foreign Affairs Committee, we've tripled the size of our sanctions team. We've given it new impetus under Kumar's Director Generalship, and we've changed legislation completely. So we've overhauled our sanctions regime. It's a lot more effective, and we've led the G7 in terms of delivering sanctions on Russia. Now, on the specific areas you mentioned, we have put in some sanctions, but of course we continue to look at what more we can do.
Well, just going back to the Russian...
And you've already suggested one earlier.
I've got another one in a moment.
So you've got another one. Well, there we are.
Yeah, well, I've got dozens, actually, if you want them. And in fact, the US has got...
If you want a job in the Foreign Office sanctions team, let me know.
I'd love one, thank you. In fact, I wouldn't mind being an ambassador somewhere. But anyway, except I'm not very good at diplomacy.
That could kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
Yeah, it might not improve relations with that country. But no, it's a serious point here. Just that
Look at some countries I'd like
the
to
US has sanctioned. The US has sanctioned an awful lot more people than we have. And what worries me is this may be about capacity, because it's tough. And I know you've had to triple the number of people working on it, and most of them, I'm guessing, are still working on the Russia ones, because some of those under the emergency provisions lapse after 2 bouts of 56 days. Will all of those be hoovered up now?
So we're working on those. We are, and the only ones that won't be renewed will be those that we don't think should actually be followed. So the sanctions that we implement have to meet our legal standards and the UK's legal tests. So what we're able to do with the emergency measure is mirror what others have done and then apply our standards to them. So I don't want to
confident that nobody will fall off that list.
I don't want to say that. What I can't prejudge is that, for example, the Canadians have met our legal standards, but what I can say is we will process them all.
That's a bit concerning. Let me just give you one more. The Sudanese Central Reserve Police. They've been responsible for the use of excessive and lethal force against protesters, human rights defenders, medical workers and opposition figures since the military coup in October 2021. The US sanctioned them in March of this year. Why can't we sanction them? Can you have a look at it?
I will.
And just one thing about assets, because it's one thing to freeze an asset. Wouldn't it be much better if we could seize some assets and redeploy them for the victims of Russia's attacks in Ukraine?
So I am supportive of this concept. We are looking very closely at this. The Canadians have in fact just passed legislation on this. This is an issue that we're working on jointly with the Home Office and the Treasury. But I certainly agree with the concept. We just need to get the specifics of it right.
That would need legislation, presumably.
Most probably, yes, but not necessarily.
Is it in prospect?
We are looking at it.
Liam.
Thanks. Just as a matter of policy, should we be sanctioning former Russian intelligence officers who have worked to undermine the British state? You said at 11:20 that Russia is our number one threat. It would seem to many on the committee that we should be sanctioning former Russian intelligence officers, especially those who have been based in the UK, who have in the past worked to undermine our interests. I'm just interested in the policy question.
So Russia is our number one immediate threat, although I do believe that in the long term we should be very, very concerned about China. So I just wanted to adjust that point. I mean, we have to look at these issues on a case-by-case basis as to whether or not somebody should be sanctioned. But in principle, if those individuals are actively involved in being of a key strategic interest to the Russian state, and that's what we changed when we put through the legislation earlier this year, then of course we should look at them on our sanctions list.
So should people like Yuri Kadimov been on the sanctions list?
Well, I can't comment on specific cases.
This is an individual who was expelled from our country in the 1980s, who was one of the conduits for running Russian money to the Front National in France. He is somebody who commutes between Moscow and London. I don't believe he is on the sanctions list. I'm interested in why not.
Well, our team continue to work through cases of people who ought to be sanctioned. We clearly don't announce those in advance of those individuals being sanctioned because we don't want them to be able to hide their resources. So 2 weeks ago we sanctioned Patriarch Kirill, for example, who has been preaching against in favour of the war in Ukraine, and we continue to look. We have a rolling programme of people are looking at, and back to
a Russian intelligence officer who was expelled from our country in 1985, who has been an active agent of influence for Putin in Western Europe, and he doesn't appear to be on the sanctions list. I'm just curious in the oversight. Is that an oversight?
It's not. I wouldn't say it's an oversight because there is a very long list of people we've been working through, and I remember coming to this committee a couple of months ago and being asked why X or Y hadn't been sanctioned. We are now in the position where the United Kingdom has sanctioned more individuals and entities than any other country in the world.
Apart from former Russian intelligence officers that we've expelled.
But I take on board your suggestion, and I will make sure that alongside all the suggestions by Mr. Bryant, it is definitely on the list we're looking at. And Chris asked earlier about the Magnitsi Sanctions. We've already tripled the size of our team to 150 people, but they have a long list to work through. I think it's fair to say. I don't know.
Okay. No, that's right.
I don't know if the pipeline has reduced. I doubt it.
No, we still have.
They were working at full
I think we've got the point. Will future sanctions policy be applied to Chinese companies that are at risk of stealing intellectual property, technology, and data?
I certainly think that together with our allies, we need to be a lot more careful about technology exports to China. We've already put in place investment screening, so we are more careful about who's investing in our country. And we are certainly looking at, in line with the whole concept of the G7 acting as an economic NATO, how can we pay more attention to China's activities and stop it undermining the global economic system. So yes, that's something where...
Sorry, Liam.
Well, just very quickly, there's 1,100 Chinese companies under some form of US control today. Do you know how many Chinese companies are subject to UK government controls?
No, I don't.
It's one.
Well, I'll add that to my list of suggestions as well.
Alicia.
Final on sanctions. When we met with the US last week, they were very surprised that Britain hasn't done more in terms of looking at things like polysilicon imports and things like solar panels. So, for example, this impacts us as constituency MPs as well. So Canadian Solar, a Chinese-owned company, plan to build in my constituency, despite the fact they've been found to be complicit in the Uyghur genocide. Could you provide some sort of update on where we are in terms of things such as polysilicon and solar companies who've been sanctioned by the US and had their shipments withdrawn, but we are allowing to continue to build new sites within the UK?
We are continuing to work through a list of companies. Sorry, it's very difficult not to go into individual companies if that's okay for obvious reasons. Yeah. But what I can assure the committee is that we are looking systematically, not just on our own, but with allies, at companies, what they're doing, not just Chinese ones, but looking at hostile state actors writ large. We are looking at what that means for our supply chain. And I think what's really important here is, as the Foreign Secretary has referred to before, is we don't do this on our own as the UK. It just doesn't work if we do it on our own. We have to do it with allies. And what we've got secured in the G7 leaders text coming up is an agreement from the G7 as a whole to look at enhanced economic security coordination mechanisms, which is a real significant step forward.
We are really moving this forward to tackle economic coercion from China.
And then moving to Ukraine, they're affirming, which I know colleagues are keen to discuss. Foreign Secretary, it'd be interesting to get your view. The Defence Secretary is clearly concerned about the West's ability to sustain its supply of weapons. And I think there's been a lot of conversation within the committee that we almost seem to be taking an approach which is when you don't give enough antibiotics, take enough antibiotics, the virus actually becomes resistant and resilient. We are risking, by not giving enough weapons that are sufficient upfrontness, that we will sustain Russia in some way. Do you agree with the Defence Secretary's concerns, but moreover, do you think there should be a 20% increase in the defence budget over the next 5 years and that we should move to 2.5% of GDP?
I do agree with the Defence Secretary's concerns. We have a real issue in terms of the availability of defence equipment, given the hugely increased security threat in Europe. And we need to increase our industrial capacity. I know the Defence Secretary recently chaired a meeting with the defence industry to talk about just this, and we're also working on this with our allies and partners. So, for example, Poland, who we have a defence agreement with, we are working on how do we get more kit. So I very strongly agree with that. I've said before that the free world did not spend enough on defence post the Cold War. And we are now paying the consequences. We also made all kinds of other strategic errors, particularly on the economy and becoming dependent on Russian oil and gas. And I do support the aims of increasing defence spending through this NATO summit, but I'm not going to get involved directly in negotiations between the Chancellor and the Defence Secretary. I have my own negotiations with the Chancellor, which Mr. Byrne was asking me earlier about on things like SDRs, so I do.
And in terms of the Chief of the General Staff, who's fantastic, General Sir Patrick Sanders, he has said that British troops need to be ready to fight in Europe again, that they may be called to serve. What's your view on those comments?
I very strongly agree with his comments. I think that is right. We cannot be complacent. The best thing we can do now is to double down on our support for Ukraine, to get more weapons quicker, to get the higher spec weapons, and encourage our allies to do that as well. Because it's a vital strategic aim that Ukraine prevail, and if they don't, it will have untold consequences for the rest of Europe.
And that hard and fast approach, why are some allies not supporting the hard and fast approach?
I think there's always a tendency, and we've seen this, prior to the Ukraine, war, there's always a tendency of wishful thinking to hope that more bad things won't happen and to wait until it's too late. And we should have done things earlier. We should have been supplying the defensive weapons into Ukraine earlier. We need to learn that lesson for Taiwan. We should have been, every piece of equipment we sent takes months of training, so the sooner we do it, the better. And I still think there are those who are hoping that things will just get better and this war will go away. And that's not going to happen. It's only going to happen by our active involvement in supporting Ukraine and stopping Russia. So,
Can I come on to two questions, just about to follow up what Alicia was saying, just about the long-term nature of the war. But before I do, can you give us an update on what seems to be something that is going to become increasingly critical, and that is the ability of the Ukrainians to export their grain, which is an important part of both the Ukrainian war effort, the non-military side, but also has profound international economic implications for the price of food, especially in the developing world. What I know the UK government is trying to do a lot. Can you update us on what you're doing and how successful it is being in getting Ukrainian grain out of the country?
So first of all, we are helping the Ukrainians with rail infrastructure to try and get more grain out through routes such as the routes through Romania. We're also working with the Ukrainians and the Turks on how we can get shipments of grain, particularly out of Odessa, but also other Ukrainian ports. And I was in Ankara last week talking to the Turks about how we do that. We've also had the Defence Secretary there. We've had naval personnel there as well to look at those issues. Is there a practical
way of shipping grain out of Odessa that doesn't include NATO shipping providing a military escort? And what is the danger of NATO shipping then, NATO vessels then providing a military escort to grain convoys?
There are currently talks taking place between Ukraine, Russia, Turkey and the United Nations to try and effect a safe passage for commercial vessels.
Without NATO escorting, without some sort of transatlantic World War II style sort of convoy?
One very important thing is there's proper protection for the ports themselves. And that's a major concern, understandably, for the Ukrainians. There's also the issue of mines in the Black Sea. And where I think the United Kingdom can really offer support is areas like maritime insurance, because clearly it's quite a high-risk venture using commercial vessels to take the grain out.
Because it is not in the Russian regime's interest to get this grain out, because they don't really care about the suffering and they want to harm
They're
Ukraine.
Weaponising it on purpose, is what they're doing.
So what's the likelihood of getting the grain out by vessels? Because the vessels enable you to get it out in significant quantities, where the other means you're going to be very limited in the quantities that you can bring out.
Well, you're right. I mean, we're doing all we can to increase the capacity together with our allies. And I know the EU are trying to relax customs controls and so on to make it easier to get the grain out of ports in Romania, for example. The only way you can really get the big quantities out is by sea. You're right about the issue with Russia, and what we are doing is we're exploring all possibilities with our allies, as well as pushing the UN solution and really putting the pressure on Russia, because it is them that are blockading these ports so the grain can't come out, which will cause untold hunger and famine around the world.
When will this result in failure if you can't get a deal? If you've got a month to get the grain out before it rots, have you got 2 weeks?
It's essentially, so it was a month last week when I was in Ankara there's a month timetable to get this done. And we're putting the maximum pressure we can through the UN, but also looking at alternatives.
And can I just go on to how do you define long term? Because what we define long term may be other people's short term. Putin, one suspects, is just going to wear us down and say, how long do you want to play this game for? Because he will continue grinding through Ukrainian territory, using an artillery-led approach for months, if not years ahead, maybe calling ceasefires in order to recalibrate when he's seized and can hold a land corridor. So have we underestimated the amount of kit that we need to supply in order to keep the Ukrainians in the game in the east, but also have the potential to break the land corridor, which implies a southern front through Kherson? So have we underestimated how much kit we need to supply, and potentially how long this is going to take?
We've always been clear that this could take a significant amount of time, and the United Kingdom is in this for the long haul, and we will take however long it takes to help the Ukrainians to push the Russian army out of their territory. So we've always been clear about that. As I've said, we need to get the modern equipment into Ukraine as quickly as possible. We're seeing good coordination amongst allies through the Ramstein process being led by the United States. And they're, of course, absolutely critical in making sure that Ukraine have the relevant equipment, because they have greater depth in terms of supplies than other nations do. And, of course, it's one of the key issues that I'm going to be talking to Tony Blinken about at the NATO Summit, which we will meet later on today or tomorrow. So this is exactly what we're all going to be talking about at the NATO Summit, to make sure we're pulling out all the stops to get the Ukrainians the equipment they need as soon as possible.
Where are the production lines for ammunition going to be coming from? Is this out of Poland and the Czechs because they can still make Soviet-era kit? Are we going to be setting up ammunition lines to supply 155 or rocket or MLRS? Is most of this going to come from the United States? And for every round that the Ukrainians are firing, the Russians are firing 10. They've got better logistics supply because they know their kit. And a lot of this kit is coming to the Ukrainians new. So the German stuff, the British stuff, all of this has a long logistics tail, as you've pointed out. How can we keep the amount of kit up to a required level for the Ukrainians to keep this first front and open up a second front without running out of time and, frankly, people?
I mean, the answer is all of the above to what you've just said. What the United Kingdom is doing is providing significant training support to make sure the Ukrainians are trained in how to use those next generation of weapons and supplies, and that's what we are very focused on. And the Prime Minister's recent visit to Kiev made an announcement about those extra levels of training we're providing.
Do you mind if I was going to ask one other question very briefly?
Very briefly.
Do you think, the pair of you, for either you, Foreign Secretary or Sir Philip, black swan moments, there is an argument to suggest that black swan moments used to be relatively rare, especially during the Cold War. Do we think we're now living in a world where we are seeing just epoch-shaping events happening at a quicker pace than we had in the 1990s, or is this just a misunderstanding of the world we live in?
I think it's two things. One is this war in Ukraine that is being perpetrated by Russia is partly due to a failure to do the right thing after the Cold War. And I talked earlier about wishful thinking. There's huge wishful thinking about the direction that Russia was going in, and we collectively failed to take enough action to prevent it. But I think there's also the aftershocks of COVID are really impacting the world. You can see through the inflation, price spikes, what we're seeing happening in energy and food, instability around the world. I think a considerable amount of that is also about the COVID aftershock. So I think we've had a combination of events, the rise of China economically, the fact that Russia went unchallenged, the aftershocks of the biggest pandemic in 100 years. So I wouldn't exactly describe those as black swan events. It's a perfect storm.
I was more thinking of the last sort of 20 years since the end of the call.
I think we're going to move on. Royston.
Just a small one, Foreign Secretary. We were out in Washington and New York last week, and one of the things we talked about a lot was whether or not you can keep the coalition together, whether you can keep the countries that are supporting Ukraine together. And there's things that will come along and make that more difficult. Take the midterms in the US, if that results in a change of political representation, then they may see that as being part of this whole problem. As energy prices continue to go up, as fuel goes up, as fuel prices go up, it's going to make it very difficult to keep the coalition together. No one seems to want to talk about it. I understand that, but from your point of view, do you think that is one of the biggest challenges if we're going to see this through to the long term, as Bob suggested?
We've heard this idea that somehow the coalition is becoming more divided over time. But in fact, in the G7, we saw huge unity in G7 leaders saying that Ukraine has to prevail, that Russia must be pushed out of Ukraine. There can be no early, unfair peace settlement. So I think we've seen continued unity from the G7. And in fact, the Commonwealth published a statement from all 54 countries on sovereignty, self-determination, and Ukraine. And that is a wide range of countries, not just the G7, also coming out in support of Ukraine. So yes, there are attempts at Russian disinformation claiming that it's sanctions that are responsible for, the rising prices, which certainly isn't true. We don't have sanctions on food. I think that's a very important point to make. But what I think we are seeing is the coalition holding together over time and remaining firm over time. And you mentioned Congress. I was in Washington a couple of months ago. It seems to me that, both sides of the aisle, whether you speak to Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell, they are all absolutely determined in their support for Ukraine and want the United States to be sending that heavy weaponry to Ukraine to support. So I think almost regardless of the results of the midterm elections, we will continue to see very strong support for Ukraine in Congress. I was very struck by how strong it was when I was out there.
They did mention to us that that was the conversation we had with congressmen, that they felt that was a challenge, and that the elections would be something that would make that make people reconsider their position, because once the electorate start to turn against your policy, it's very difficult to hold it together.
We've got just a few minutes left, and I know a few other people want to jump in very quickly on the Commonwealth. I'm sure you celebrate the reappointment of Baroness Scotland as chair of the Commonwealth.
We, as you know, we publicly supported Camilla Johnson-Smith, who is the very good Jamaican foreign minister. The election was a close-run thing. Baroness Scotland won, and of course we respect that democratic result.
Delighted to hear it. Henry.
Foreign Secretary, turning to the British Indian Ocean Territory, there have been some worrying signs, I think, coming out of the Mauritian government. It is now apparently illegal for Mauritians or anyone to criticise Mauritian sovereign claims over the Chagos Islands. Additionally, there have been a number of environmental concerns which the Mauritian government haven't handled very well. And then there was a sort of publicity voyage to Chagos several months ago, which ostensibly was for environmental reasons, but was really there to plant Mauritian flags. There's also concern about growing Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean as well, with Port Louis. Will you restate your belief, as I understand it, that there is no question as to UK sovereignty over the Chagos Islands?
So we're very clear that UK has sovereignty over the British Indian Ocean Territory. We've held it since 1814. Mauritius has never held sovereignty, and we don't recognise its claim. Last week at Kigali, I met the Mauritian Foreign Minister to talk about how we can work more closely together in areas like the economy and security to build a closer relationship on those other issues.
Okay, Chris, you wanted to...
Yes, just about Colombia. Colombia's been a key ally of the UK in Latin America for a very long time, under successive governments, even when they've been really difficult governments like Uribe's, and when there hasn't been much progress on the peace, and there are still many millions of people who are displaced. It's one of the largest areas of displaced people in the world. And of course, there's issues around the relationship with Venezuela and drugs. New election, great new president. I'm sure you've welcomed his election and his deputy, first black woman to take such a role in Latin America. A major step forward. Anything to say about Colombia?
Well, Colombia is a very important partner for NATO. It's our only Latin American global partner, and obviously we work very closely on security, defence, countering narcotics, and I congratulate Gustavo Petro on his recent election.
He has said that he wants to end the war on drugs. How do you feel about that?
Well, as I say, we're determined to work closely with the Colombian government on countering narcotics.
And would you encourage him to sort out the land issues that have bedeviled many millions of people, in particular, and have made it impossible to achieve peace?
I mean, we continue to support the implementation of the peace agreement.
Alicia, you want to ask?
Yes, very briefly, just to get back to Royston's point, I would just stress that in our meetings with ambassadors from around the world, not the G7, not the key, there were a number of countries who genuinely said that they are more focused on the food, and that the argument that the sanctions are not affecting food, which we know is not the reality, is, however, genuinely taking bite, and they are more focused on being seen to not take sides and to make sure they don't end up in a food crisis than they are about supporting Ukraine, which I think was quite striking in I won't name the countries, but a large number of countries they met with. You just now, when I asked you about Ukraine, you said that we need to learn the lessons for not arming Ukraine early enough when it comes to Taiwan. So are there active conversations taking place about providing defensive weapon systems to Taiwan? And can you give us an idea of what that looks like for you?
What we've been talking about with our G7 allies is making sure that Taiwan has the capabilities to defend itself.
And have any of those capabilities been provided as yet?
Sorry?
Have we provided any capabilities as yet?
Well, we do provide capabilities to Taiwan, as do other allies around the world. What we're doing is working with our partners to make sure that they do have those capabilities, because we need to defend the country.
Can I just briefly go back to Libya as we close, because you made an interesting point that I'd just like to pick up on, which is you said that this was all about the elections. Did your officials brief you on the conversation that was had about elections?
What conversation?
With Bashar.
I have had conversations with my officials about the issue. I'm not sure if I was specifically briefed on that conversation.
I'll take that as a no. You said you were out of the country. You did go to the fundraiser on Monday night, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yes.
He arrived on Monday morning. And given that it wasn't a policy position, would you meet with both of the candidates, one of which has been disqualified by the UN for the position?
I'd be very happy to meet with both, yes.
Excellent. And has your ambassador in Tripoli had any contact with any of them?
I believe they have, but I can't confirm that.
I'll check. I'm sure she would have done, but I'll have to double check.
Excellent. Well, look, we promised you out by 1 o'clock.
Thank you very much.
3 minutes early. And may I say
thank you for moving the meeting forward so I could get to Madrid.
Indeed. Well, it matters to all of us. And please take our huge support to Sweden and Finland for joining NATO.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Order, order.